Nobody called it a crime, that's how they got away with it. Christmas morning, Charleston was already full of forgiveness. Bells ringing, families laughing, wine poured heavy enough to make sins feel lighter. And 3 streets off the churches, behind brick walls with iron teeth on the windows, 70 lives were waiting to be priced. Ryan's mart didn't smell like blood, it smelled like pine. Holly was nailed to the posts. Green branches draped along the railings. Somebody took time with it. Somebody wanted the place to feel righteous, festive, like what was about to happen belonged to God as much as it belonged to money. Sarah Mitchell stood inside the rope with her children pressed against her legs, and she understood something most people never do. This wasn't hatred. This was business. Hatred is loud, sloppy. It burns itself out. This was quiet, organized, smiling. Thomas stood to her left, 12 years old, long arms, trying to stand straight because he'd already learned that posture could decide how much pain you'd see later. His eyes, those light eyes, kept drawing attention no one would name. Men noticed. Women noticed. Nobody said why. Mercy stayed close on her other side, 9 and sharp, watching faces the way people watch exits. She didn't trust the room, and she was right not to. Grace held onto Sarah's skirt with both hands. 6 years old, still operating under the dangerous belief that mothers can stop anything if they want it badly enough. Sarah kept her breathing slow. She'd been trained for rooms like this her whole life. Not this exact room, not this scale, but the rules were familiar: be useful, be calm. Don't challenge the lie that keeps everyone comfortable. Slavery didn't survive this long on chains alone, it survived on choreography. They'd washed them earlier, fixed the clothes, smoothed hair, told the children to smile if spoken to, show teeth, stand still, look healthy, make yourself worth buying. Men leaned in, hands resting casually on the rope like it was a fence at a fair. One checked Thomas's arms without asking. Another looked Grace up and down with a practiced eye and nodded to himself, already imagining where she'd fit. Sarah didn't react. Reaction gives them control. She'd spent 14 years in the Hartwell house learning how power really works, cooking meals she'd never eat, managing rooms she didn't own, running a household so smoothly that the people inside it forgot she was there. That's the trick. You make yourself invisible until they mistake your labor for the natural order of things. Then one morning the old man fell face first into his breakfast and the order shifted. Debts don't mourn. They came with ledgers and polite voices and said the estate was finished. Property would be liquidated. Assets sold. And Robert Hartwell Jr. stood in the yard and said it without choking. House, land, people. He couldn't look at Thomas, couldn't look at Mercy, couldn't look at Grace at all. That was 3 weeks ago. Now it was Christmas Day and Charleston was singing. A band played carols in the corner. Silent night floated through the room while buyers adjusted cuffs and weighed decisions that would follow children for the rest of their lives. Sarah felt the rope tighten behind her as guards repositioned. That wasn't security, that was preparation. She scanned the crowd once more and found Reverend Webb in the back. White collar, nervous eyes. A man trying to do good quietly because doing it loud would get him crushed. He told her he'd try. That word again. Try. She didn't blame him. Trying was expensive in rooms like this. The auctioneer stepped forward, voice polished, confident, like he was about to sell furniture instead of futures. Lot 47, he announced. Sarah's spine straightened on instinct. The game had started, and the first move wasn't hers. Not yet. Because in this room, the real danger wasn't the hammer. It was how many people were already deciding which child they wanted. Before the bidding even began, the first bid came fast, too fast. That's how Sarah knew the room had already made up its mind. 1,000. The number landed clean, confident. No hesitation, no testing the water. Somebody wanted control early. Sarah didn't flinch. She'd seen this tactic before, not in auctions but in kitchens, in back rooms, in the way men assert dominance without raising their voice. You move first so everyone else reacts to you. 1,200. Another voice, louder, competitive now. The auctioneer smiled. He loved momentum. Momentum meant money. Sarah's eyes stayed forward, but her mind was working, counting hands. Tracking who leaned in, who sat back, who looked at her children too long. Thomas felt it. His jaw tightened. 12 years old and already reading danger like a grown man. Mercy whispered, barely sound, "Mama." Sarah pressed her fingers into Mercy's wrist. A signal, "Stay still." 1500. That one came from the back. Reverend Webb. Sarah didn't look at him, but she felt it. The strain behind the number, the weight of it, that was sacrifice money. That was everything he had left. For half a second, hope slipped in. That's when the other voice entered, calm, amused, untouched by effort. 2,000, the man said, for the woman. Not the children, not the family, just her. The air changed. A ripple ran through the crowd, not outrage, not discomfort, but interest. This wasn't charity anymore. This was strategy. The auctioneer's eyebrows lifted. 2,000 for Sarah alone, he repeated, letting the words stretch. Do I hear any offers for the full lot? Silence answered him. That silence wasn't empty. It was agreement. Why buy 4 when you could buy 1 now and carve the rest up cheaper? Sarah felt Grace's grip tighten on her skirt. Mercy stiffened. Thomas's eyes darted to the man who'd spoken, trying to place a face on the voice that had just redrawn their future. Sarah knew better. Faces didn't matter. Money did. The auctioneer tapped the podium once, thinking. Well then, he said pleasantly, we'll sell separately. That was the moment. That was when the crime stopped pretending to be polite. No, Sarah said before she could stop herself. The word cut across the room like broken glass. The auctioneer snapped his head toward her, irritation flashing. Quiet. A guard stepped in, hand clamping onto her arm. Not brutal, not yet, just firm enough to remind her who owned the space. You know the rules, the guard muttered. Don't make trouble. Sarah tried again, her voice breaking through restraint. My children, please. The guard's grip tightened. One more word, he said, and you'll regret it. Thomas grabbed her hand. His palm was sweating. He was shaking, but he didn't cry, not yet. Mercy pressed her face into Sarah's side, breathing fast. Grace started to sob. She didn't understand bids or numbers or strategy. She only understood separation. A woman near the front waved her hand, annoyed. This is unpleasant, she said. Sell the children first. Get it over with. The auctioneer didn't hesitate. Good idea, he replied. Remove the woman. Sarah's body reacted before her mind could catch up. No, she shouted. No, Thomas. Hands seized her, pulled her backward off the platform. Her feet scraped the floor as she fought without swinging, without striking, fought like a mother trying to become immovable. Thomas was dragged forward, 12 years old. The auctioneer took his arm and raised it, inspecting muscle like he was checking grain. Strong boy, he announced. Good for field work. Starting bid 400. Sarah screamed his name. The sound cracked something open inside her chest, and the bids started coming anyway. Fast, efficient, relentless. Because once the system starts eating, it doesn't stop to listen to mothers, and Sarah could already see it in their faces. They weren't deciding if they'd take her children. They were deciding which one came first. They took Thomas like he was already gone. The auctioneer didn't look at his face. Didn't need to. He held the boy's arm up, turning him slightly so the crowd could see what they were buying. Strength. Years. Obedience still unbroken enough to be useful. 400. The number floated out easy, like this was the safest bet in the room. 450. 5. Sarah strained against the guard, her voice tearing itself apart. That's my son, please. Nobody answered her, because answers would have made this personal. 550. Thomas stood there, lips pressed together, eyes glassy but focused. He wasn't looking at the buyers anymore. He was looking for Sarah, anchoring himself to her face like it might keep him standing. She locked eyes with him and nodded once. Not goodbye, instructions. Survive. 600. The bidding slowed. Buyers leaned back satisfied. The room had tasted blood and decided it was enough. 625, a man called, voice lazy. The hammer came down. Sold. That sound didn't echo, it sealed. Thomas turned his head as they pulled him away, his eyes wide now, panicked, searching. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He disappeared the way boys do when the world teaches them too early that resistance gets you hurt. Sarah felt something tear loose inside her chest. But the room didn't stop. It never does. Next, the auctioneer said, already moving on, the girl. Mercy, 9 years old, small, shaking so hard her knees knocked together. She cried openly now, the rules forgotten. "Mama, please." Sarah lunged. The guard slammed her back again, harder this time. Pain flared, sharp and bright, but she barely registered it. All she could see was Mercy being placed where Thomas had stood seconds earlier. "Healthy," the auctioneer said. "Trainable, good temperament." Good temperament, Sarah almost laughed. 300. Hands went up immediately. Mercy's eyes darted wildly, trying to find something solid in a room full of strangers who wanted her. 350. 4. Her breathing turned ragged. Sarah screamed her name. 510. The hammer fell again. Sold. Mercy was pulled away kicking and crying, her voice breaking into sobs that followed her down the corridor. Sarah screamed back until her throat burned, until her voice failed, until there was nothing left but air tearing in and out of her lungs. Two gone. The room shifted in its seats, uncomfortable now, not because of what they'd done, but because the noise lingered. "Last child," the auctioneer said, clearing his throat. "The youngest." Grace, 6 years old. She clung to Sarah like her life depended on it because it did. "No," she sobbed. "Mama, don't let them." Sarah dropped to her knees, rule-breaking forgotten. "Listen to me," she whispered fast, fierce. "You remember me. No matter what they tell you, you remember." Grace nodded, tears soaking her face, fingers digging into Sarah's skin. Hands tore her away. Grace screamed, not the sharp cry of fear, the deep, panicked sound of a child being pulled out of her world. A woman in the front raised her hand immediately. 400. No one challenged her. Some people don't get challenged. The hammer fell. "Merry Christmas," the auctioneer said. Grace's cries faded as she was carried off, arms reaching back, mouth forming Sarah's name until the sound broke apart. Silence followed, not respectful, satisfied. Sarah collapsed where she stood, the guard releasing her because she no longer mattered. Around her, the auction continued. Other families, other mothers learning the same lesson. Then the auctioneer called her name again. "Sarah," he said. "Final lot." Hands grabbed her shoulders, hauled her upright. Her children were gone, all 3. And now the man with the calm voice leaned forward again, smiling like this was the part he'd waited for. Sarah lifted her head slowly, eyes empty, understanding something that chilled her deeper than fear. They hadn't just sold her children, they'd stripped her defenses. And now they were about to see how much a broken mother was worth. They didn't rush this part. That's how Sarah knew it mattered. The room settled. Chairs creaked. People adjusted coats, stretched fingers, took sips of wine like they were pacing themselves for a longer game. The crying had stopped, and that made everyone more comfortable. Silence is expensive. Silence means control has been restored. Sarah stood where they'd put her, shoulders squared by habit, eyes hollowed out by loss. Someone wiped her face again, quick and rough. A clean product sells better. 1,000, the auctioneer said, voice reset, professional. "For the woman." A hand went up, then another. 1,200. 15. The numbers floated past her without meaning. They weren't tied to anything real anymore. Not to her hands or her back, or the years she'd held a household together so smoothly nobody noticed it ran on her spine. She heard Reverend Webb again. 1,800. His voice cracked on the edge of it. That was sacrifice money. That was faith pressed flat and spent anyway. Sarah finally looked at him. He looked like a man who knew he was about to lose and was standing up anyway. Then the calm voice spoke. 2,500. The room leaned toward it. Respectful now, that was power announcing itself. Webb stood, desperate enough to stop pretending. 2,600, he said. Everything I have. The man turned slowly in his seat. He was smiling, but it wasn't joy. It was ownership warming up. "Why?" he asked, loud enough for everyone. "Why ruin yourself for her?" Webb straightened, knowing the risk. "Because she just watched her children sold away from her," he said. and I believe no one should leave this place without at least a chance at freedom." The word freedom landed wrong, too honest, too sharp. A few faces hardened, others looked away. The smile vanished from the man's face. "Well then," he said, smooth again, "your belief just got expensive." "What? 3,000. No one else spoke. Webb sat down slowly like gravity had doubled. The hammer came down. Sold. Was it? No applause, no reaction, just the clean end of a transaction. Sarah was led away, no longer interesting. Broken things don't draw bids. She sat on the floor in a holding room while the world moved on without her, her mind suddenly clear in a way grief sometimes makes possible. The pain was still there, but it had sharpened into something usable. Reverend Webb found her later. "I tried," he said, quiet, ashamed. "I know," Sarah replied. Her voice surprised them both. Steady. Flat. "I'm not finished," he added. "I'll find out where they went. I'll keep looking." She nodded once. Mr. Whitman arrived before dark, clean coat, cold eyes. A man who didn't waste words on people he owned. "You're valuable," he said. "I expect results, obedience, no trouble." "Yes, sir," Sarah answered, because the word knew how to leave her mouth even when everything else was gone. That night, alone on a pallet in a strange kitchen, Sarah let herself feel it once, all of it. Then she closed that door inside herself and locked it tight, because she understood something now that she hadn't before. They could take her children. They could scatter them like contraband. But they had made one mistake. They assumed the sale was the end of her story. And Sarah Mitchell was done letting other people decide when her story stopped. Harleston disappeared behind her without ceremony. No last look, no lingering. Whitman's wagon rolled at first light, wheels biting into damp earth, carrying her away like inventory moving between warehouses. That's what plantations were, distribution centers for suffering. And Whitman S. was a big one, rice land, flat, wet, endless, the kind of place where people vanished slowly. Whitman kept his word about one thing. Sarah wasn't sent to the field. He'd paid too much for that. She ran the house instead, kitchen, schedules, servants, silence. The same work she'd done before. The same mask. That's where he miscalculated. He thought familiarity meant compliance. What it really gave her was cover. Sarah learned the rhythms of the plantation the way a thief learns locks, who drank too much, which guards got lazy at night, how long it took to walk the perimeter, which roads led toward Charleston and which ones led nowhere at all. At night, when the house slept, she sat alone and rebuilt her children in her mind. Thomas's walk, Mercy's voice, Grace's hands. She repeated them like coordinates. Reverend Webb came months later under the excuse of Scripture. Whitman liked being seen as a godly man. He let Webb preach. Let him teach. Let him wander just enough. That's when Webb leaned close and said the first true thing Sarah had heard since Christmas. "War is coming. Not maybe, not someday, coming." The country was splitting like rotten wood. North and South arguing over ownership like thieves fighting over stolen goods. Webb told her chaos was ahead, real chaos, not the controlled kind she'd just survived. "And when it breaks," he said, "people like you will have openings. Small ones, dangerous ones, but openings." Sarah listened. She didn't ask when, she asked how to be ready. By the time the guns finally spoke, she was already waiting. The early years of the war didn't free anyone, they just rearranged cruelty. Men left to fight, overseers got meaner. Rumors moved faster than orders. Hope traveled through quarters like contraband. Then Union lines crept closer. Then came a word that spread like fire. Contraband, property that escaped wouldn't be returned. Not free yet, but not owned either. That was enough. On a moonless night in May 1863, Sarah left Whitman Plantation with nothing but direction and refusal. She walked through rice fields barefoot, water biting at her calves, insects tearing at her skin. She hid during daylight, stole food when she could, moved like someone who knew there was no turning back. 3 nights later, she crossed into Union lines. A captain tried to slow her down, told her Charleston was chaos, told her looking for children in wartime was impossible. "I made them a promise," Sarah said. That ended the conversation. Charleston wasn't the city she remembered. Burned buildings. Union uniforms. Empty houses that once held too much power. She went straight to the names she'd memorized. The Buffetts first. Grace came running down the steps like she'd been waiting her whole life. Older now, changed, but her arms knew exactly where they belonged. They left before anyone could stop them. Mercy took longer, years longer, stolen again near the war's end. Sold illegally, disappeared west. Sarah didn't stop. She searched through registers, churches, whispers, broken systems meant to help and failing anyway. And one day a letter came, Texas. A girl asking about a mother named Sarah Mitchell. They walked most of the way. When Sarah saw Mercy again, 16, scarred, alive, the world finally exhaled something back to her. Thomas never came home. She searched for him until her body refused to carry her further, until hope learned how to sit quietly beside grief without disappearing. When Sarah died years later, 2 daughters stood at her grave and told her story forward, not as a tragedy, as evidence. Evidence that the system tried to erase them and failed. Evidence that love outlived ownership. Evidence that the real crime wasn't cruelty, it was how ordinary it was. And that's sometimes the most dangerous thing a system can't account for. Is a woman who refuses to stop being a mother. They never put her name on a plaque, no marker at Ryan's Mart, no sermon that year about what really happened 3 streets from the church. Charleston kept its posture, cities always do. They survive by forgetting on schedule, but forgetting isn't the same thing as erasing. Because what Sarah Mitchell did broke a rule the system depended on. She remembered. That was the crime. Slavery didn't just sell bodies, it sold endings. It taught people that once a hammer fell, a story was finished. That separation was permanent. That love had an expiration date if you applied enough pressure. Sarah proved otherwise. Not by winning, not by saving everyone, not by getting justice, but by refusing closure. That's what haunted them. The planters who walked past her daughters years later and didn't recognize the women they once owned. The churchgoers who sang the same carols and felt something tighten in their chest without knowing why. The families who told themselves they were good people because they never looked too closely at what they bought. They all lived in the aftermath of a woman who wouldn't stop searching. Thomas's absence never healed. It never resolved into a lesson anyone could feel clean about. That mattered too, because neat endings are how crimes get forgiven. Sarah didn't give them that comfort. She left behind something worse, a question that wouldn't shut up. What happens when the people you break don't disappear? What happens when memory survives paperwork? What happens when love outlasts ownership? That's why the story kept traveling, not in textbooks, not in monuments, but in kitchens, in whispered warnings, in names passed down and corrected when someone tried to soften them. Christmas didn't belong to them anymore, not fully. Because somewhere beneath the hymns and the lights and the wrapped gifts, there was always the knowledge, quiet, inconvenient, permanent, that on that same day, families were destroyed on purpose and ordinary people called it tradition. Sarah Mitchell never got justice, but she got something systems fear more. She got witnesses, and once a story has witnesses, it doesn't stay buried. The crime didn't end when slavery did. That's the part people miss when they try to lock this story in the past. Ryan's Mart closed, the laws changed. The words on paper shifted just enough for the country to tell itself a different story. But the structure, the instinct to profit from silence, to dress cruelty up as order, to call violence normal, that survived. It learned new language. It stopped using hammers and started using contracts. Stopped using chains and started using debt. Stopped selling children in public and started separating families quietly. Sarah Mitchell never saw those systems. She didn't need to. She understood the pattern. She knew power always wants the same thing, control without accountability. That's why her story didn't fade. It didn't stay in 1859 because it wasn't really about slavery alone. It was about what happens when a society decides some families are negotiable, when love becomes a liability, when morality bends just enough to let people sleep at night. Every generation that heard Sarah's name heard a warning with it. Don't trust clean explanations. Don't believe comfort means innocence, and never assume the system will protect what it profits from breaking. Mercy told her children the truth without decoration. Grace told hers without apology, not to make them angry, but to make them alert. Because alert people are harder to manage. The men who built slave markets relied on forgetfulness, on time smoothing edges, on the belief that once something is legal, it's forgivable. Sarah's life argued otherwise. She didn't overthrow anything. She didn't rewrite the law. She didn't get her son back. But she left behind something more dangerous than revenge. She left behind memory with teeth. And that's why this story still unsettles people. Because if you really listen to it, you can't hide behind "that was a different time." You have to ask harder questions. Who pays when we call cruelty tradition? Who benefits when separation becomes policy? And what promises are being broken quietly right now while everyone else is celebrating? Those questions don't expire, and neither does Sarah Mitchell's refusal to disappear. There's a reason stories like this make people uneasy, not sad. Uneasy. Sadness lets you feel something and move on. Unease sticks. Unease asks follow-up questions. Unease doesn't clap when the lights come up. Because once you sit with Sarah Mitchell long enough, you realize something dangerous. The people who destroyed her family weren't monsters. They were neighbors. They went to church. They raised children. They sang hymns about mercy while participating in a system that required mothers to be broken in public so everyone else could feel secure in private. That's the line they never crossed in their minds. They didn't think of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as normal. And that's why Sarah's story survived. Because it exposes the lie that cruelty needs hatred to function. It does. It just needs permission, routine, and people willing to look away when the screaming starts to interrupt the mood. Ryan's Mart didn't survive because people were evil. It survived because people were comfortable. Sarah disrupted that comfort without ever raising her hand, without burning anything down, without asking to be remembered. She simply refused to disappear quietly. She refused to accept that paperwork could cancel motherhood. She refused to accept that separation meant surrender. She refused to accept the ending they assigned her. And that refusal traveled. It traveled through daughters who told the story straight, through grandchildren who learned not to trust clean versions of the past, through communities that understood survival isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about leaving evidence. That's what Sarah Mitchell became, evidence. Evidence that systems built on ownership fear one thing more than rebellion: continuity. Because rebellion can be crushed, violence can be justified, but memory that keeps showing up generation after generation, that makes the crime permanent. And permanence is the one thing power can't afford. That's why even now this story feels like it's looking back at you, not asking for guilt, not asking for pity, asking something harder. What are you willing to remember? When forgetting would be easier. No court ever ruled on what happened at Ryan's Mart. No jury sat through testimony about children priced separately to speed up a sale. No judge asked whether Christmas decorations made the crime better or worse. The law of the time had already decided, cleanly, confidently, that nothing illegal had occurred. That was the verdict. And it should bother you how easy it was, because systems don't need bad laws to survive. They need accepted ones. Rules everyone agrees not to question because questioning them would mean admitting how much damage they authorize. Sarah Mitchell lived long enough to see the law change on paper. She didn't live long enough to see accountability. That gap matters, because what replaced slavery wasn't justice. It was silence with better manners. The same people kept their homes, their money, their reputations, their certainty that history would remember them gently if it remembered them at all. Sarah didn't get a courtroom. She got a kitchen table, daughters on either side telling the story again so it wouldn't drift, so it wouldn't soften, so nobody could say we didn't know. That was her verdict. Not guilty of forgetting, not guilty of surrender, not guilty of accepting the ending she was handed. And here's the part that turns the story back on us. Every generation gets moments like Ryan's Mart, not identical, not always as visible, but moments where harm is normalized, where convenience beats conscience, where someone else's family pays for stability. Most of those moments pass without a record, unless someone refuses to let them disappear. Sarah Mitchell didn't win. She testified with her life, her search, her refusal to close the book. And testimony doesn't need a courtroom to be valid. It just needs witnesses. You're one now. Power thought time would fix this. That's always the bet. Wait long enough and the sharp edges dull. Names blur. Pain turns into context. Crimes get reclassified as complicated chapters. Eventually, the story becomes safe enough to teach without anyone feeling accused. That's what they expected to happen to Sarah Mitchell. They expected her grief to stay private, her search to fail quietly, her children's names to fade into paperwork and rumor. They expected the sale to do its job. It didn't, because power misunderstood the kind of woman it was dealing with. Sarah didn't resist in ways power recognizes. She didn't riot. She didn't threaten. She didn't burn anything down. Those are the kinds of defiance systems train themselves to handle. She did something far more destabilizing. She persisted. She treated memory like a duty, not a wound. She treated motherhood like a lifelong contract, not a role that expired when a hammer fell. She outlived the moment she was supposed to be reduced to. That kind of endurance doesn't look dangerous at first. It takes years before anyone realizes what it's done. By the time Sarah's daughters were grown, Charleston had started telling cleaner stories about itself. Softer ones. Stories where slavery was unfortunate but distant, cruel but abstract, resolved neatly by time and progress. And then mercy or grace would correct someone. Quietly. Precisely. No, they'd say. That's not how it happened. And just like that, the room would shift. Because power hates corrections. Corrections imply a record, a memory, a version of events that can't be managed. Sarah didn't give them a single dramatic ending to package. She gave them a long, unfinished one. That's why this story keeps surfacing when people least expect it, around holidays, in churches, in moments meant to feel pure. It doesn't interrupt to accuse, it interrupts to remind. You don't get to celebrate innocence without accounting for what was done in its name. That's the miscalculation. They thought they were selling for people. What they actually sold was proof that the system was never as stable as it pretended to be, because it only worked as long as everyone agreed not to remember. And Sarah Mitchell never agreed. Every system leaves something behind. Sometimes it's monuments, sometimes it's wealth, sometimes it's silence. What slavery left behind wasn't just trauma, it was inheritance. Not just for the people it broke, but for the people who benefited from the breaking and then walked away pretending the ledger was clean. Sarah Mitchell understood that long before anyone put language to it. She saw it in the way people spoke after the war, careful, selective, eager to move on. In the way former owners talked about loss without ever naming what they'd taken. In the way churches prayed for healing without confessing what they'd helped normalize. That's how crimes age. They don't disappear. They get rebranded. Sarah's daughters inherited more than her story. They inherited the responsibility of carrying it without letting it turn into bitterness or myth. That's harder than anger. Anger burns fast. Stewardship lasts. Mercy became precise with her words. Grace became relentless with hers. Different temperaments, same mission. They didn't tell the story to shame people. They told it so it couldn't be edited. So nobody could claim ignorance when patterns repeated. When families were separated by policy. When children were treated like collateral damage. When suffering was framed as unfortunate but necessary. Sarah never used the word inheritance. She didn't need to. She lived it. She passed down something heavier than grief and more useful than rage. Discernment. The ability to see when power is lying politely. The instinct to ask who pays for order and who profits from calm. That's the inheritance that still unsettles. Because once you have it, you can't unknow it. You start noticing how often comfort depends on someone else's quiet loss. How often celebration and cruelty share the same calendar. How often people say, that's just how things were, when what they really mean is, that's how we allowed them to be. Sarah Mitchell didn't leave her children a fortune. She left them a lens. And once a story gives you that lens, it doesn't just ask you to remember the past. It forces you to look harder at the present. Stories like this don't stay where you put them. You can label them history. You can fence them off with dates. You can teach them in a tone that sounds finished. But some stories resist containment. Sarah Mitchell's is one of those because it doesn't resolve into comfort. It doesn't end with justice served or wrongs neatly righted. It ends with absence, with a son who never came home, with answers that never arrived. And that unfinished edge is exactly why it survives. Systems depend on endings. Endings let people close books, move on, feel absolved. Sarah's life denied them that. Even in death, she didn't offer closure. She left behind a question that kept asking itself every time someone tried to smooth the past into something palatable. What do you do with harm that was legal? What do you owe when the crime followed the rules? Those aren't academic questions. They're structural ones. They decide how societies remember themselves and who gets written out when memory becomes inconvenient. That's why this story still feels dangerous. Not because it accuses, because it refuses to let anyone feel finished. It reminds us that legality is not morality, that tradition can be weaponized, and that silence is often just violence that learned better manners. Sarah Mitchell never got to confront the people who broke her family, but she outlived their version of events. And that may be the most disruptive outcome of all, because when a story outlives the system that created it, it becomes evidence, and evidence doesn't fade, it waits for the next person willing to listen and realize that some crimes don't ask for forgiveness, they ask for reckoning. Here's the part that history textbooks don't know what to do with. Sarah Mitchell's story doesn't point to a single villain you can comfortably condemn and walk away from. There's no final courtroom scene, no apology, no redemption arc that lets everyone breathe easier. That's intentional, because the crime wasn't committed by one man with a hammer. It was committed by a system that functioned perfectly. Ryan's Mart wasn't a secret. Christmas auctions weren't rare. Family separation wasn't an accident. It was policy with good lighting. That's why the reckoning never finished. You can't resolve something that was designed to look normal while it was happening. You can't punish ghosts when the structure that empowered them quietly folded itself into the future. Sarah understood that long before anyone framed it that way. She didn't wait for justice to arrive. She lived as if it might never come and acted anyway. That's the kind of reckoning power hates, one that doesn't ask permission, one that doesn't need validation, one that survives without acknowledgement. Her daughters carried that forward. They didn't demand recognition. They corrected lies when they heard them. They taught their children to ask uncomfortable questions in rooms that preferred peace. And slowly, quietly, that did something courts never could. It made denial harder, because denial thrives on silence, on gaps, on stories that end too cleanly. Sarah's story left no gap wide enough to hide in. It followed people. It showed up at dinner tables and church socials and classrooms where someone tried to soften the past into something easier to digest. And every time someone said, "That wasn't really how it was," there was an answer ready. Yes, it was. That's the reckoning that never finished. Not a moment, a pressure, not a verdict, a memory that refuses to sit still. And as long as stories like Sarah Mitchell's keep being told this way, not sanitized, not sealed, not turned into symbols, then the system that once depended on forgetting never fully gets its peace. Because the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be remembered. There was one thing no bill of sale ever covered. They listed bodies. They priced skills. They cataloged ages, scars, temperaments. But they never learned how to measure resolve. That was the flaw. Sarah Mitchell lived inside their accounting for most of her life. She understood how numbers worked, how value shifted depending on who was speaking and who was listening, how the same hands that counted money refused to count consequences. And still, when the system finished with her, when it had taken what it wanted and written sold beside her name, there was something left over. They didn't own her memory. They didn't own her love. They didn't own the meaning she gave her suffering. Those things stayed free long before emancipation ever made it official. That's why her story didn't collapse when she died. It didn't belong to the state. It didn't belong to the church. It didn't belong to history books looking for neat lessons. It belonged to the people who inherited it and refused to make it comfortable. Every time someone tells this story straight, without softening the buyers, without romanticizing endurance, without pretending the harm was incidental, it does what Sarah did in her own lifetime. It interrupts. It reminds us that systems can be lawful and still criminal. That violence doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like organization. Sometimes it hums along under garland and hymns and polite applause. And it asks the same question Sarah's life asked without ever speaking it aloud. What will you refuse to let be owned? Because that answer, whatever it is, determines whether history repeats itself quietly or gets caught in the act. They sold everything they could reach: bodies, labor, futures, even the illusion of choice. But there were limits to what a transaction could touch. Sarah Mitchell understood that by the time the wagon rolled out of Charleston, by the time the city folded back into celebration and left her loss behind like swept ash, by the time the system declared the matter finished and moved on to the next ledger, what survived wasn't hope in the soft sense. It was continuity, the thing power never plans for. Continuity is dangerous because it doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly. It waits. It teaches. It shows up in kitchens and bedrooms and long walks where stories are told not for inspiration, but for accuracy. Sarah didn't leave behind instructions for revenge. She left behind orientation. How to recognize when harm is being laundered into tradition. How to notice when violence hides behind procedure. How to hear screaming even when music is playing over it. That's what her daughters passed on. Not a myth of resilience, not a moral fable, a record that said, this happened, this was allowed, this is what it cost. And that record kept doing damage to the lie that slavery was a distant aberration, to the comfort of people who wanted to inherit celebration without responsibility. That's what survived the sale, not justice, not fairness, but truth with memory attached. And memory, once it's attached, becomes portable. It crosses time, it crosses families, it crosses denial, which means the system never fully got what it paid for. Because what it needed most, silence, was the one thing Sarah Mitchell never agreed to sell. Power likes clean endings, a gavel strike, a signature, a sale recorded and closed. But this story never gave them that satisfaction. Because somewhere between Charleston and Georgia, between kitchens and cotton rows, between a child being renamed and a mother being reassigned, something stayed unaccounted for. A debt, not money, memory. The kind that doesn't fade when laws change or uniforms disappear. The kind that waits inside people who were supposed to forget. Thomas carried it in his back. Mercy carried it in her silence. Grace carried it in what she refused to unlearn. And Sarah carried it like a map folded tight against her chest. Every system believes the same lie. That time will do the erasing. That distance will finish the job. That children grow, mothers age, and eventually the past runs out of witnesses. They were wrong, because long after the auction house was repainted, long after the mart became a storefront, long after the men who bid called themselves honorable and died believing it, the receipt was still out there, unpaid, passed hand to hand, name to name, generation to generation. And here's the part history never likes to sit with. Receipts don't expire, they wait. And sooner or later someone always comes back to collect. Nobody rang a bell when it ended. No announcement. No apology. Just a quiet moment when the music stopped playing loud enough to cover the screams. That moment didn't come all at once. It never does. It came in pieces. A question asked too plainly. A story repeated too accurately. A child refusing to forget a name they were told never to speak again. That's how systems really weaken. Not from attack, but from exposure. Because once people start hearing the same story told the same way, without decoration, without forgiveness baked in, something shifts. The lie gets heavy. The silence starts to itch. Charleston learned that slowly. Years later, people still walked past the old auction site without looking, still celebrated holidays in the same houses, still told themselves the past had been handled, settled, closed. But every now and then, someone would ask a question that didn't fit. Why were there no records of certain children after 1859? Why did some families change names right after the war? Why did certain women never speak about Christmas? And when those questions surfaced, the room would go quiet, because everyone felt it, that unfinished feeling, that wrongness that didn't belong to the present but never stayed in the past either. Sarah Mitchell never stood trial, never stood on a podium, never demanded recognition. She did something more dangerous. She lived long enough for her truth to outlast their certainty, and certainty hates endurance, because endurance proves this wasn't an exception, it was a method, and methods don't die when laws change, they just adapt. Somebody always wants to believe the story is over, but stories like this don't end. They wait, right beneath the surface, and the moment someone listens without flinching, the moment the music can't drown it out anymore, the reckoning starts all over again. Here's the part nobody writes down. What gets passed on isn't just pain. It's instinct, an inherited sense for danger, a way of reading rooms, a habit of listening for what isn't being said. Sarah's daughters carried that. So did the people who heard their story second-hand and third-hand, and much later from someone who couldn't even name where they learned it, only that it felt true. That's how power really loses ground, not when it's confronted, when it's remembered too clearly to be rewritten. The men who bought and sold on Christmas Day believed they were final. They believed the hammer erased responsibility. They believed the paper mattered more than the people. But paper doesn't raise children. Paper doesn't whisper names in the dark. Paper doesn't keep score the way memory does. And memory is patient. It waits through generations that think they're innocent. It watches celebrations repeat themselves. It lets people say that was a long time ago without interrupting. Until one day someone asks the wrong question in the wrong room, and the air changes. Because the inheritance isn't rage, it's awareness. And awareness is dangerous. Because once you have it, you start noticing patterns, who benefits, who disappears, who gets to forget. Sarah Mitchell didn't leave behind wealth. She left behind clarity. And clarity has a way of finding people who thought the debt was settled. That's the part still moving, still waiting, still unfinished. There's a moment every system depends on. The moment after the damage when everyone agrees not to talk about it. That silence is the real transaction. Charleston tried to make that deal. They tore down signs. They renamed buildings. They let time sand the edges off the story until it felt distant, abstract, almost polite. But Sarah's story never stayed polite, because it wasn't built on spectacle. It was built on detail. A boy's eyes looking back while being led away. A girl taught to say yes to survive. A mother memorizing footsteps because it might be the last time. Details don't fade cleanly. They linger, they leak. They show up in places people don't expect. Family arguments, church sermons, uneasy jokes, sudden discomfort when certain topics come up. That's how you know something didn't resolve. If it had, it wouldn't still make people defensive. What they sold on that block were bodies and futures. What they never managed to sell was consent. Sarah never agreed with the story they told about her life. Her children never agreed to forget each other. And the people who inherited that truth never agreed to call it ancient history. That refusal, that quiet, persistent no, outlived the auctioneer, the buyers, the laws, the uniforms. It outlived the excuses too. And that's the danger power never accounts for. You can dominate people. You can scatter families. You can rename cruelty as tradition. But you can't force belief. And without belief, the whole structure is just standing there, waiting for the day someone finally admits it was wrong. What scares power isn't anger, it's pattern recognition. Because anger burns fast. But patterns travel. The people who benefited from that auction believed the story would shrink with time, that it would soften into trivia, that it would become something you mention in museums with quiet voices and safe conclusions. They didn't account for what happens when memory moves instead of settles, when it learns how to speak in new rooms, when it waits for the right moment, when it shows up inside people who weren't supposed to carry it. That's when the debt learns to walk. It doesn't knock. It doesn't announce itself. It just arrives. In conversations that go off script. In questions that don't have comfortable answers. In a sudden understanding that the past isn't past at all. Sarah Mitchell never chased recognition. She chased reunion. And even in what she didn't recover, she exposed something permanent. that the system only works when everyone agrees not to look too closely. That cruelty depends on ceremony. That celebration can be weaponized when memory is suppressed. And once that's seen clearly, it can't be unseen. That's the real inheritance. Not trauma, not sorrow, but sight. And sight changes behavior. It makes people hesitate where they used to cheer. It makes silence feel loud. It makes old traditions feel unstable. Because somewhere under the music, under the lights, under the rituals people never questioned, there's still a ledger, and it's still open. And sooner or later, every system built on forgetting has to answer to the people who remembered anyway. Long after the auction ended, long after the songs faded, long after everyone who raised a hand was buried and praised and forgotten. There were still names that didn't settle, not carved into stone, not printed in books, just spoken carefully in rooms where people trusted each other enough to be honest. Sarah Mitchell wasn't remembered because she won. She was remembered because she refused to disappear. Because even when the system took her children, her body, her years, it never got her permission to forget them. That refusal outlived the hammer, outlived the music, outlived the lie that time heals what was never treated. History likes endings that feel clean. This one is. It's quiet, unresolved, still watching. And every time someone celebrates without asking what it once cost someone else. That's where the story waits, cold, patient, unfinished.